Hello, everyone. Welcome to day one of TLC, our Teaching and Learning Conference. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Holly Lopez. I'm a lead faculty here at UAGC, and I'll be host of this session. This session is comprised of 4 different presentations. The session is called Cultural Competence, the Elephant in the Room. Our first presenters will be Yolanda and Stephanie. By joining us today, you acknowledge that this session is being recorded and will be shared with TLC related materials. Microphones will be muted for this presentation, but we encourage you to post questions and comments in the chat. Also, we have enabled live transcription. If you'd like to use it, click the live transcription button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Now, I'm pleased to introduce you to Dr. Yolanda Harper and Dr. Stephanie Anderson. Dr. Stephanie Anderson is assistant professor here at the College of Arts and Sciences at UAGC, and she's been with us since 2014. Dr. Yolanda Harper is a professor in the College of Arts and Sciences, and she's been here since 2013. Ladies, we look forward to what you have to share with us today.
Thank you so much, Holly, and thank you everyone for being here. So good morning to some, good afternoon to others. As you know, human beings, we have biases, right? And sometimes we use stereotypes or shortcuts to make sense of patterns that we perceive in the world. Sometimes the mechanisms that fuel our beliefs and our assumptions about these patterns that we perceive are conscious, and sometimes they're unconscious. People generally don't mind as much being stereotyped if the characteristics are those that they actually positively identify with, but they can still cause challenges in the workplace and in other interpersonal interactions. But typically, we really don't realize we're saying things in a group that could offend others or make them feel less than. But when we do, oftentimes we think we're correct, right? Or at least that our point of view is valid in that particular interaction. One of the things that reasons that we're doing this, though, is that leaders, when those in leadership, and all of us are in leadership in different positions, different times, when we have implicit biases, they can impact on basically communicating what is acceptable and what is considered unacceptable in terms of behaviors. And specifically, leaders support organizations through our actions and their actions of hiring, promoting, and guiding people. And when we have unexamined implicit biases, that can result in conflicting interactions and actions and inconsistencies between our behaviors and statements that can make the organizational environment very ambiguous, uncomfortable, stressful for others in terms of how to treat others with positive regard and respect.
So we want to start here, and we want to invite you to think about this. And if you'd like, you can type into the chat. When you think about diversity in the workplace, what comes to mind? What are some of the facets of diversity that you encounter or that you expect to encounter in the workplace? So I'll give you just a few seconds to think about this. So very frequently, when we think about diversity, the kinds of things that do come to mind for us are things that have to do with an individual's internal levels of diversity, but there are many other layers to consider. So the graphic on the next slide is going to highlight some of those different aspects of diversity that we oftentimes overlook. So if you look in the center is our personality. This is me, this is who I am, my worldview, and some of the unique and very eccentric habits that I might have. Those types of diversity we can maybe expect amongst ourselves and others. What we tend to find people noting when they're considering diversity in the workplace would be that middle ring, that blue ring of internal characteristics. So things like race or gender or sexual orientation, things that are intrinsic to a person, and oftentimes things that may be explicitly identified in policies or in laws that surround treatment of others in society and in the workplace. But if you notice, that's only a small part of the differences that exist between us. So external factors, things like appearance and attractiveness or weight, something like that, parental status, marital status, military status, religion and nationality, all of those are features that are going to be very important or central to a person in some cases, and are not necessarily protected or even recognized as elements of diversity. And so it's pretty easy to sometimes make a comment or hold a bias and treat a person perhaps differently, and maybe possibly even in a way that we find positive, but would make that person feel uncomfortable by highlighting something about that person that is different. And sometimes in a not so positive way on either end. And then again, we also have this outside ring of organizational differences. So obviously within any sort of organizational setting, there are vast differences in terms of roles that we play and the hierarchy that may exist. And those kinds of distinctions between individuals can lead to potential bias or potential stereotypes and therefore differences in treatment. So let's start by talking about stereotypes. And I think all of us have heard this term. The simplest definition is just a belief about a person on the basis of their group membership. So if I identify as being a woman, then it's very likely that you may hold some beliefs about me on the basis of me fitting into that category. Some of our stereotypes are descriptive, so they would describe a person based on that category, and some are prescriptive, and that has to do more with how we would expect them or think that they should act based on that category. Not necessarily that they do, but how they should act. We all do hold stereotypes. Some of them are positive, and as Dr. Harper mentioned earlier, sometimes those kinds of stereotypes might be perceived in a more neutral or even positive manner, but they do have the potential of being damaging as well. And so that is something that we need to keep in mind. And of course, there are many stereotypes that can be negative in terms of content, and then of course in terms of outcomes. So why do we hold stereotypes if they have this potential to be so damaging? Well, we're cognitively lazy and we like to take shortcuts. So when we don't have enough information to make a decision, we turn to those categories that we make in our heads about people, and we use those to fill in the gaps and tell us something about them to make a quick decision. So, and this can lead to bias. And we are aware of two different forms of bias: explicit bias and implicit bias. Explicit bias is that controlled, conscious sort of bias, something that we know we have. We're aware of these things. In some ways, this seems perhaps less problematic. If we know we have it, then maybe it's easier to address, but not necessarily. If we're holding explicit biases that we're quite fond of, we're going to be very attached to those, and it might be really difficult to get them to change. Explicit bias is generally thought of as being taught, something that we learn from others around us. Social learning theory would be one way of looking at how we grow to understand our interactions with people who are different than us on some level. Implicit bias is the more automatic or unconscious form of bias that we may hold. And you can think about this as being caught in a manner. So we're like social sponges. And while we may not explicitly hold beliefs that are negative toward a particular group, it's quite possible that if those beliefs are, as they've sometimes been described, stereotype threat, for example, a threat in the air, It's something that's just out there in the environment, and we unconsciously, on a level that we're not recognizing, pick that up, soak that in, and it may then impact our behavior toward others or our feelings about them, even if it's not necessarily explicit. Our explicit and implicit biases don't necessarily have to correspond. They often do, but it's not required that they do. A couple of other relevant terms that I just wanted to point out here. One would be confirmation bias, and that is just our tendency to seek information that confirms what we already believe. So if I already believe something about a member of a particular group on the basis of their group membership, I'm going to be searching for aspects of their behavior that confirm that bias and looking for that. And that's not helpful in terms of creating more positive relationships and allowing that person to be an individual. Belief perseverance is another term. So even if this person that I hold some sort of belief about, some sort of stereotype, disconfirms that by their actions, I might still hold on to my belief because perhaps it's just an exception. There's something unique about the situation. But in reality, I might still anticipate that all others in that particular group would act or believe a certain way. Another one that I did mention that's not on this slide, I do want to mention again, and that is stereotype threat. And that's the idea or the notion that if there's a belief about me on the basis of my group membership, that when I'm engaging in an activity that's relevant or to that belief, and that belief is salient, that might create anxiety in me and therefore influence my performance. So go ahead.
So what happens when the implicit bias becomes explicit, or it remains implicit to us, but someone else acknowledges it, brings it to our attention, or we even catch ourselves behaving in a way that's inconsistent with our explicit biases? We might experience cognitive dissonance, which you see described here. It's a kind of emotionally, psychologically uncomfortable feeling or state that happens when we have conflicting beliefs, values, or attitudes, or our actions don't match our values. Or sometimes it comes up in situations where, let's say, a topic related to diversity, bias, stereotype comes up, and somebody immediately says, well, I have no biases, I have no stereotypes. So that's kind of an emotional reaction to some tension going on underneath the surface. So when that happens, we may act in ways to try to minimize that discomfort when we realize that there are inconsistencies or there's that threat of someone perceiving us in a way that we prefer not to perceive ourselves. Clearly, there are healthier ways and less healthy ways to resolve that discomfort. Some of the less optimal ways are denial, rationalization, kind of avoiding or suppressing, which can provide short-term relief, but doesn't lead to any long-term positive change. Some alternative ways, though, that could have a potential for longer-term positive growth. We could examine and potentially change our beliefs or change a portion of our beliefs to be more consistent with kind of what the larger or different realities are that are out there. We may choose to change our actions. We may choose to change our perceptions of the actions. So any of those can help to bring the dissonance down. And certainly there are some questions that we can ask ourselves to help resolve that, as well as helping to make implicit biases more explicit so that we can actually control our reactions to them better. But as you think of statements that you might have heard that could negatively impact organizational climate, please share in the chat any that come to mind. And what was the impact? How did you respond? Or how might you respond differently? And of course, if we want to go deeper, can we think of a time that we might have said or done something negative that negatively impacted the workplace environment? So I'm going to pause a moment to allow people to. Okay. Dana did comment that she had not thought about the organizational diversity. Yeah, we have a lot of images in our mind of what these different labels and roles are, and that can impact how we interact with others. Dana shared about a previous work environment in which ageist beliefs were connected to seniority. Interesting. And individuals with more seniority were not necessarily seen as valued.
And I think that's a good example of a form of bias that might be different in terms of implicit and explicit bias. Mm-hmm. So a person may not be aware of the fact that they're thinking about or treating somebody different on the basis of age, but it's something that just happens. And it does take some of this, introspection, very conscious consideration of our own beliefs and how we're handling that potential dissonance to really get at the root of that.
Great. Thank you for elaborating on that and sharing. So let's look at some of the potential consequences of not addressing the culture of stereotypes and societal assumptions in the workplace. Many may be able to think of cliques that are formed in organizations, that there are kind of unstated, it's not published anywhere, but there's just a knowledge of there being certain people are on the in group and other people are in the out group. And those in the in group kind of get the first shot at opportunities, not necessarily on purpose, but just because they're hanging out together more, they hear more about the opportunities. When people are very conscious of not being in the in group, they may feel socially isolated. And with repeated attempts to try to connect and become a part of the in group, if those opportunities aren't there, they're consistently looked over for opportunities, or other people seem to hear about them first. Then eventually at some point they may withdraw, their engagement may become very minimal. And then there are a whole host of stressors that can accompany that. And the emotions may include anger, frustration, eventually burnout, and if prolonged, can even lead to physical illness and absenteeism.
So let's consider for a moment the importance of inclusivity and what the general benefits of having an inclusive workplace are before turning to some strategies that we might use to better foster positive relationships and eliminate some of those negative biases that we may hold. So a more inclusive workplace tends to be more collaborative instead of competitive. The decision-making process is generally more thoughtful in that it prevents the possibility of groupthink. Multiple different points of view can really help us come to a better solution and avoid making a decision without really fully thinking through the implications from various different perspectives. Team performance is better. It also makes the organization more attractive to new hires. Individuals are much more likely to want to go someplace that looks like the organizational atmosphere is positive and supportive and encouraging. It's also going to be more stable because those folks who are already employed in this organization are going to be more satisfied with the environment and more likely to continue their employment. It leads to better innovation or more innovation and creativity. Individuals employed have the flexibility and the freedom to think outside of the box and to use their unique perspectives and are celebrated for that. And ultimately, it leads to a more profitable venture when we're avoiding some of the instability and the other kinds of negative implications that come along with a hostile work environment on the basis of friction between people who are working together. So if we want to think about creating organizational inclusivity, a couple of things come to mind. The first is that we really need to be intentional it's not something that's going to happen without that conscious, thoughtful examination of ourselves. Because as mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, we all do hold biases. We all do hold stereotypes. And if we're not able to recognize those, that process of cognitive dissonance is going to end up in a place that doesn't allow us to deal with them and to root out the negative beliefs that we have and improve our relations with others. So it takes some conscious self-reflection. Also, in terms of our actions, announcing opportunities several times and through multiple modalities. Getting outside of that, well, these are the folks that I always hang out with. These are the people who are more familiar to me. But branching out and maybe going beyond what's comfortable, and not just necessarily accepting the first person who volunteers, but checking in with others regarding those missed opportunities and making options available to those who might not be as likely to reach out and jump on that first opportunity. If we're intentional with our thoughts, we also want to be intentional with our actions and taking a step toward reaching out as opposed to just being receptive. And then also considering our own unconscious or conscious bias. And both of these things are important to consider. So in terms of unconscious bias, of course, there are different measures, steps that people can take to do this. The conscious bias is something that will really require one to do that difficult self-reflection and then taking active steps to foster collegial relationships with those around us. In particular, those who may be different from us on any number of levels. So thinking back to that initial graphic with the various different types of diversity, not just limiting ourselves to the obvious or to the most commonly discussed, but recognizing that diversity includes so many different aspects of an individual and considering all of those elements.
Yes, and we'll definitely share some more very specific recommendations in our Elephant in the Room panel session later today. So I hope you'll stay with us and join us there about ways to raise our self-awareness. Now, many of us are very familiar with the NACE competencies for a career-ready workforce. NACE updated their competencies this year and rebranded the Global Intercultural Fluency competency as Equity and Inclusion. We may be accustomed to using these competencies to guide our work in course development and engaging students in the classroom. But these competencies are equally relevant to us, for us. We're in the workplace. So doing some self-reflection and making a commitment to actively model these types of behaviors is a very important first step, or can be. So let's look at some of these sample behaviors a bit closer. And again, we invite you to join us in the chat, ways that you yourself or have seen others engage in some of these behaviors and other relevant behaviors. So how often do we solicit and use feedback from multiple perspectives to make sure we're making inclusive decisions? Are we seeking interactions with people? Here it talks about global cross-cultural interactions, but even as Holly mentioned earlier about cross-departmental interactions. Or do we stay in our own program, stay in our own department for the most part? What resources do we have to eliminate barriers from various types of inequities? So these principles can be transported and translated into other types of difference that we encounter in our workplace. And I'll just put this little reminder up here quickly. We're not going to really spend a lot of time on this, but similarly to the NACE competencies, the Department of Education has some competencies around proficiency and being able to advance equity, excellence, and economic competitiveness. Again, reflecting on these for ourselves with all types of diversity. Again, we can translate the principles into other interpersonal contexts in which differences can become an issue. I want to spend a little bit more time here on the 5 R's of cultural humility. And again, these principles, we're expanding them out beyond the typical types of diversity we often think of. But these are the 5 that are discussed by Robinson and colleagues. So I know time is getting away from us, so I'll kind of move through these more quickly. We'll start with reflection though. And so for each of the 5 R's, there's an ultimate goal here, as it says, to approach encounters with humility and remember that we can learn something from everyone. So going back to Dana's wonderful example, wonderful but unfortunate example of the interaction of seniority and ageism, what can I learn from anybody, regardless of where they are in their position? There's a wonderful book, A Boy, a Burrito, and a Cookie, that I encourage you to read. It's a really quick read. Basically, it's the story of how a janitor at Frito-Lay invented the most popular Cheeto out there, the flaming Cheeto, and now from inventing that travels the world as a motivational speaker. So again, we can learn something from everyone if we're open to that. So as we interact with others, we can reflect on what did I learn from that person. Respect, of course, we hear a lot about that, and respect, particularly in this regard, reminding us of the platinum rule, treating others like they want to be treated, not just how we would want to be treated. In terms of regard, reflecting on, again, after an interaction or even during an interaction, the extent to which biases drove how I responded and how I filtered what I heard. And if we have set an intention, an expectation that cultural humility will be relevant and applied to all practices within our organization, then we can intermittently reflect on how exactly was that reflected. And then certainly as we think about resilience, and we hear a lot about resilience these days in a lot of different contexts, but it's equally relevant here. Because in our interpersonal interactions, it can be helpful to check in with ourselves. How was my personal resiliency impacted or affected by this interaction? In the graphic below, we see some elements of resiliency, so after interacting with different people throughout the organization, I feel like my flexibility and ability to plan was stifled or expanded. My ability to adapt to change. When I leave a meeting with a person, am I energized and ready to go to the next one, or do I need to just recuperate from that interaction? Do I feel more motivated to pursue my own personal goals within the organization, or I feel like there's just so many barriers and stumbling blocks, I'm just going to not even going to pursue anymore? Again, so resiliency impacts so many different areas of our lives, and it's just important. It can be useful to reflect on how our interactions with others impact our own resiliency, their resiliency, and the overall resiliency of the organization, because ultimately, the more each individual and each unit succeeds, the more the organization as a whole will succeed. So with that, we'll open it up to questions, and I'll take a peek at the chat.
I actually think we are at time. So we're hoping that folks will come back and join us at 12 o'clock Pacific time, I believe, is what Holly just posted in the chat. And we would love to follow up on any of these concepts or ideas at that time too.
Absolutely. Thank you. And we do have a few more minutes since the next session starts at 11, but please do come back to this room at that time, and also when the whole team will be here answering questions. Thank you both so much, Yolanda and Stephanie. That was an amazing presentation. I especially love the part that inclusivity, it just is good business. So that was amazing. So I'm looking forward to our next session, which will start at 11. In the meantime, please do get to your next session, or some of our participants and our hosts will be on in case you have any questions.
Thank you, everyone.